Ed Sullivan stood backstage at CBS Studio 50, his face flushed with anger as he confronted Mick Jagger just minutes before the Rolling Stones were scheduled to go live to 70 million Americans. It was January 15, 1967, and Ed had just discovered that the Stones planned to sing "Let's Spend the Night Together" exactly as written, including the sexually suggestive lyrics that Ed had explicitly forbidden. "You will sing 'Let's Spend Some Time Together,' or you don't perform at all," Ed said through gritted teeth. Mick looked back with defiant eyes that seemed to say he had no intention of backing down. What happened in the next 6 minutes would create one of the most controversial moments in television history, and prove that even Ed Sullivan couldn't always control rock and roll rebellion. Before you hear this explosive story, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to witness is the night when television's most powerful host met his match in rock and roll's most dangerous band. To understand why Ed Sullivan was so determined to censor the Rolling Stones, you need to understand what the band represented to mainstream America in 1967. While the Beatles had been marketed as lovable mop-tops who your daughter could safely scream about, the Rolling Stones were explicitly marketed as the anti-Beatles, dangerous, sexual, rebellious, everything that parents feared about rock and roll. By January 1967, the Rolling Stones had already established themselves as rock music's bad boys. Their hits like "I Can't Get No Satisfaction" and "Paint It Black" had a darker, more sexual energy than anything the Beatles produced. Mick Jagger's stage presence was overtly sexual, his lyrics were suggestive, and the band's image was carefully crafted to appeal to teenage rebellion while horrifying their parents. Ed Sullivan had booked the Rolling Stones 3 times before in October 1964, May 1965, and September 1966. Each appearance had been successful from a ratings standpoint, but each had also pushed the boundaries of what Ed considered acceptable for family television. The band's energy was undeniable, but their attitude was consistently challenging. The January 1967 booking was different because of the song the Rolling Stones wanted to perform. "Let's Spend the Night Together" had been released as a single just weeks earlier, and it was climbing the charts rapidly. But the title and lyrics were explicitly about spending the night with someone, not for conversation or innocent companionship, but for the obvious sexual implications that the phrase carried. Ed's first reaction when he heard the song was immediate and absolute. "They are not singing that on my show." But the Rolling Stones were insistent. This was their current hit, their biggest song at the moment, and they argued that performing anything else would be dishonest to their fans and their artistic integrity. The negotiations between Ed's office and the Rolling Stones management had been tense for weeks. Ed's position was non-negotiable. If the band wanted to appear on The Ed Sullivan Show, they would have to modify the lyrics to "Let's Spend Some Time Together," changing just one word but completely altering the song's meaning and impact. "It's one word," Ed told his producers. "They change one word and everyone's happy. The song keeps its melody, they get their television exposure, and America doesn't have to explain to their children what spending the night together means." But the Rolling Stones saw the censorship demand as an attack on their artistic freedom and their deliberately provocative image. Mick Jagger, who was 23 years old and at the height of his rebellious period, viewed Ed's demand as exactly the kind of establishment control that rock and roll was supposed to challenge. "They want to neuter us," Mick told the other band members during a rehearsal 3 days before the show. "They want to take everything dangerous about what we do and make it safe for middle America. If we give in on this, what's next? Do we start wearing suits and singing love ballads?" Keith Richards, the band's guitarist and Mick's primary creative partner, was equally resistant to the censorship. "We've worked for years to build an image that's different from the Beatles, different from all the clean-cut pop bands. Now they want us to throw that away for 6 minutes on television." But their manager, Andrew Loog Oldham, understood the commercial reality. "The Ed Sullivan Show reaches 70 million people," he argued. "That's more exposure than you'll get in 10 years of touring. You can afford to compromise for one song one night." The debate within the band continued right up until the day of the show. Some members wanted to make the change and take advantage of the massive television exposure. Others wanted to refuse the censorship demand and maintain their artistic integrity, even if it meant losing the biggest platform in entertainment. The day of the show, January 15, 1967, arrived with the issue still unresolved. The Rolling Stones arrived at CBS Studio 50 for their sound check, and the tension was immediately apparent. Ed watched their rehearsal with obvious discomfort, not just because of the lyrics controversy, but because of the band's entire presentation. Even during the sound check, the Rolling Stones were more aggressive, more sexual, more challenging than anything Ed typically allowed on his show. Mick's movements were deliberately provocative, Keith's guitar work was harsh and driving, and the overall energy was designed to unsettle rather than comfort audiences. After the sound check, Ed called a meeting with the band in his office. It was the confrontation that both sides had been building toward for weeks. "Gentlemen," Ed began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had controlled American television for over a decade. "I need your word that you will sing the modified lyrics tonight. Let's spend some time together. That's the only way this performance happens." Mick Jagger looked directly at Ed with the kind of insolent stare that had been driving authority figures crazy since he was a teenager. "And if we don't agree to your censorship, then you don't perform," Ed replied simply. "I've built this show on family entertainment, and I won't have sexually explicit lyrics broadcast into American homes on my watch." Keith Richards spoke up from the corner of the room. "What exactly do you think spending the night together means? That's so dangerous for American families." Ed's face reddened. "I think you know exactly what it means, and so does everyone else. That's precisely why it doesn't belong on family television." The room fell silent as the two sides stared at each other. Ed Sullivan representing traditional broadcast standards and establishment control, the Rolling Stones representing youth rebellion and artistic freedom. Neither side was willing to back down. Finally Mick spoke. "We'll give you our decision right before we go on stage." "That's not acceptable," Ed said firmly. "I need your commitment now." "Then you'll have to trust us," Mick replied with a slight smile that could have meant anything. Ed Sullivan had been in television long enough to know when he was being manipulated, but he also understood that he needed the Rolling Stones more than they needed him. Their appearance would deliver huge ratings, and canceling them just hours before broadcast would create a different kind of controversy. "Fine," Ed said through gritted teeth. "But understand this, if you sing those lyrics as written, this will be your last appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, ever." As the band left his office, Ed realized he had just made the biggest gamble of his television career. He was about to go on live television with performers who might openly defy him in front of 70 million Americans. The hours before the live broadcast were tense. Ed's producers suggested having a backup act ready in case the Rolling Stones had to be cut from the show. Ed's wife Sylvia called to wish him luck, sensing his unusual nervousness about the evening's broadcast. "Are you sure about this, Ed?" she asked. "Maybe it's not worth the risk." "It's too late to back down now," Ed replied. "Besides, they're young men, not criminals. Surely they understand what's at stake." But Ed wasn't as confident as he tried to sound. He had dealt with rebellious performers before, but never ones who seemed so committed to challenging authority for its own sake. At 8 p.m. Eastern Time, the Ed Sullivan Show went live to the nation. Ed did his opening monologue, introduced the first guests, and tried to maintain his usual professional demeanor while privately dreading what might happen when the Rolling Stones took the stage. Finally, it was time. Ed walked to his mark and delivered his introduction with characteristic formality. "Ladies and gentlemen, from England, the Rolling Stones." The studio lights dimmed, and suddenly the Rolling Stones were on stage. Mick Jagger in tight pants and a frilled shirt, Keith Richards with his guitar slung low, the whole band radiating an energy that was immediately different from anything typically seen on family television. The opening chords of "Let's Spend the Night Together" began, and 70 million Americans held their breath, though most didn't know exactly why. Ed watched from the wings, his stomach in knots, waiting to hear whether Mick would sing the censored or uncensored lyrics. Mick stepped up to the microphone, his movements already more sexual and provocative than Ed had ever allowed on his show. The studio audience, filled with teenage girls, began screaming with an intensity that surprised even the experienced CBS crew. And then Mick began to sing, "Don't Hang Me Up and Don't Let Me Down." The first verse proceeded normally, building tension toward the moment when Mick would have to choose between night and time. Ed found himself holding his breath, realizing that his entire reputation was riding on the decision of a 23-year-old rock singer who had every reason to humiliate him on national television. Then came the chorus, and Mick sang, "Let's spend the night together, now I need you more than ever." The original lyrics, uncensored, exactly what Ed had forbidden. Ed's face went white. In the control booth, the director looked toward him for guidance. Cut away? Go to commercial? Let it continue? Ed made a split-second decision. He held up his hand, signaling the director to keep the cameras rolling. Cutting away would create more controversy than letting the song continue, and stopping the performance would make Ed look weak and out of control. But something strange was happening during the performance. While Mick had sung the controversial lyrics in the first chorus, by the second time through, he was clearly mumbling the word night, making it almost impossible to understand. He was technically singing the forbidden lyrics, but in a way that made them barely audible. It was a perfect compromise from Mick's perspective. He hadn't backed down completely, but he also hadn't openly humiliated Ed on live television. The performance was rebellious enough to maintain the Rolling Stones' bad boy image, but subtle enough to avoid a complete scandal. The song ended to thunderous applause from the studio audience, and Mick looked directly at the camera with a slight smirk that suggested he knew exactly what he had just done. Ed walked onto the stage, his usual post-performance routine, but his interaction with the band was noticeably cooler than his typical warm handshakes. "Thank you, Rolling Stones," Ed said stiffly, and the band left the stage without the extended conversation that usually followed performances. Backstage, the confrontation that everyone expected finally happened. "What exactly did you just do out there?" Ed demanded as soon as the cameras stopped rolling. "We performed our song," Mick replied calmly. "Did you hear something inappropriate?" Ed realized he was trapped. Mick had technically defied him, but in such a subtle way that Ed couldn't definitively prove it without looking petty and foolish. The lyrics had been mumbled enough that most viewers probably didn't catch the exact words. "You deliberately sang the uncensored lyrics," Ed said. "Did I?" Mick asked with mock innocence. "I thought I was just having trouble with the microphone. Sound systems can be tricky, you know." Ed stared at Mick for a long moment, realizing he had been outmaneuvered by someone young enough to be his son. The Rolling Stones had managed to have it both ways, technically defying his censorship while giving him enough plausible deniability to avoid a complete scandal. The immediate reaction to the Rolling Stones' performance was explosive. CBS switchboards were flooded with calls from outraged parents who had heard the forbidden lyrics, and from teenagers who were thrilled that their favorite band had gotten away with something rebellious on national television. Newspaper critics were divided. Some praised Ed for maintaining control over his show and preventing complete chaos. Others criticized him for booking the Rolling Stones in the first place, arguing that the band was fundamentally incompatible with family television. But the most significant reaction came from other rock performers, who saw what the Rolling Stones had done as a template for how to handle television censorship. You could technically comply with broadcast standards while still maintaining your artistic integrity and rebellious image. Ed himself was conflicted about the evening. From a ratings perspective, it had been hugely successful. The Rolling Stones episode drew one of the largest audiences of the season. But Ed felt that his authority had been challenged in a way that could set a dangerous precedent for future bookings. Over the next few weeks, Ed received dozens of requests from other rock bands who wanted to appear on his show. Many specifically mentioned their willingness to work with him on lyric modifications, seeing the Stones' appearance as proof that compromise was possible without completely surrendering artistic integrity. But Ed also instituted new policies for rock band bookings. Future performers would have to agree to lyric changes in writing, with signed contracts specifying exactly what would and wouldn't be allowed. The informal negotiations that had characterized the Stones' booking would never happen again. Months later, when asked about the incident in an interview, Ed was diplomatic but honest. "The Rolling Stones are talented performers, but they represent a more aggressive style of entertainment than what I usually present. I'm not sure that style is compatible with family television." Mick Jagger, in his own interview, was more direct. "Ed Sullivan represents everything we're supposed to be rebelling against at Ed authority, censorship, the establishment trying to control art. But he also gave us a platform to reach millions of people. It's complicated, The January 1967 Rolling Stones appearance became a defining moment for both the band and the Ed Sullivan Show. For the Stones, it proved they could challenge authority without completely destroying their commercial opportunities. For Ed, it demonstrated that the cultural changes happening in America were bigger than any single television show could control or contain. Looking back, the incident represents a perfect snapshot of 1967 America as a country caught between traditional values and revolutionary change. Between establishment control and youth rebellion. Between maintaining order and embracing artistic freedom. Ed Sullivan never booked the Rolling Stones again, keeping his promise that their defiance would end their relationship with his show. But the band didn't need him anymore. They had proven they could succeed while maintaining their rebellious edge, and their career continued to soar without television's most powerful platform. The legacy of that January night was complex. It showed that even the most powerful figures in entertainment couldn't completely control the cultural revolution happening around them. But it also demonstrated that compromise was possible amidst that rebels and establishment figures could find ways to coexist, even if neither side was completely happy with the result. If this story of rebellion and authority moved you, hit that subscribe button and tell us, have you ever had to choose between following rules and staying true to yourself? Sometimes the most interesting moments happen when different generations try to find common ground while neither side backs down completely.